For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon Ryhove. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me to discuss the Freedom Charter 60 years on. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you.
Is the attachment to the Freedom Charter some 60 years on not a romantic notion?
Yes, I think there is some romanticization in the sense that, during the struggle, identification with the Freedom Charter was an act of defiance. It was an act of allegiance. It was an act of attachment to the ANC, even though the Freedom Charter was not the property of the ANC alone. So it's very important, 60 years later, not to simply learn it by rote, but to scrutinize the Freedom Charter and ask ourselves, is this still valid 50 years later? And to what extent can it be applied literally? The Freedom Charter is, to me, on the one hand, a universal type call for freedom, which applies to everyone in the world, but it also has very specific things in relation to South Africa of the 1950s, some of which have been rectified, some of which have not been rectified. Then it has a series of demands. And the question becomes, do those demands remain valid in 2015? Now, the obvious demand that is in very many people's minds and in the discourse of the time is the question of the wealth. And I think it's very important that we must understand that the climate of the times was one where you had Labour and social democratic governments coming to power and saying that they wanted to have control over the commanding heights of the economy, and in many cases controlling some sectors like the national health or some banks, enabled our governments to provide for welfare and also to use public revenues in a way that stimulated the economy. Now, in the intervening years, a number of lessons have been learnt, and one of the lessons is that state control over various sectors of the economy is not necessarily beneficial to the poor. I mean, a nationalization of the mines is a bit of a misnomer because the mines are already state-owned. It's a question of licensing. It's a question of taxation. Are they taxing these people enough? I mean, the studies done on the platinum mines where Marikana occurred shows that they didn't seem to tax them very heavily. Also, we need to ask who are going to be beneficiaries of what is called nationalization, which is supported by some leading BEE capitalists. Now, why do they support this? What is the reason? Who will be the beneficiaries? Will the beneficiaries be the poor? And I think we've got to be undogmatic. Nationalization is not necessarily an answer or handing over land. We have to ask ourselves, how does land get transferred to the people to benefit the people? And a number of issues arise from this, and we've got to work out, in some circumstances, is privatization beneficial? But on the other hand, is it desirable to privatize distribution of basic needs like water, where the Constitution provides that people have the right to basic needs?
Which are the areas that you think need to be rethought?
Well, it's common, as I've indicated, to refer to the economic clauses, but I think there's a lot of other clauses that need debate. I think the Freedom Charter will only survive. Now, I am not attached to the Freedom Charter as a religious article of faith as I was some years ago, as a basis for identifying with a cause. So I'm looking at the Freedom Charter as a basic human rights document from which we could learn. But we can't learn in a literal way. What I've said this before, what liberation theologians say is that it's not the letter that is important, but the spirit of the document and the emancipatory freedom, character of the Freedom Charter is more important than the letter. The letter, the words, have to be scrutinized and argued over. For example, culture and custom. Now we have King Zwelithini and other kings and chiefs claiming land supposedly on behalf of the people. Now, in pre-colonial times, the land wasn't owned by the chiefs. Insofar as the chiefs held land in trust, they did not own it themselves. It belonged to the community as a whole. And we've got to scrutinize very carefully whether these land claims are going to benefit the poorest of the poor and the landless in these areas. Whether the Ngonyama Trust, for example, operating in KwaZulu-Natal, is something that is beneficial to the ordinary landless people, or whether it is not. Now, there are attacks on people who say this, especially Africans, and they are suggested they've got a contempt for their customs and they're buying into the white people's knowledge and so forth. But the idea of centralizing ownership in the chief or the king is a European construction. It came in KZN, especially during the Shepstonian period. From the chief or the king down to the homestead, you have this situation where women who used to have some rights to property are excluded from it because sole ownership is supposed to be vested in the head of household or head of the chieftaincy or the kingdom. And that wasn't the case in the old days. It couldn't be the case because if you denied people access to grazing land or to cattle or other things, they would eventually leave. And that's why you have this situation of people, chiefdoms and kingdoms breaking up and people going and owing allegiance to someone else. So that is one aspect of the question of custom, but I think the question of culture in general is something that needs to be interrogated. There is this idea, it was prominent especially in the case of the spear painting, where some people designate themselves as official custodians of African culture. And anyone else who argues otherwise, like there are lots of examples throughout this continent of exposed genitals in works of art. But what they're trying to do is to shut down debate and say this is un-African or an insult to Africans. Now, what we need instead is to say, if the Freedom Charter says the doors of learning and culture shall be opened, or we must respect the culture and language of all people, what does that mean? And argue over the meanings. What this country needs is debate, not the shutting down of debate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the need to rethink the Freedom Charter.